This evening, we have Greg Deckler with us, who is going to be taking us through DAX for humans and how he enables DAX to be a little bit easier and more functional. Next, coming up, these are the speakers that we have in the next few weeks, which should keep you nice and busy, and I'm really excited about. Now, let me hand over to Greg, who's going to take us through DAX for humans.
So yeah, I'm thrilled to be here. We're going to be talking about really the DAX for Humans is really about no calculate. Really, it was the YouTube channel I started to kind of teach the no calculate approach, and it's been on hiatus for a little while because I've been summer vacations and then moving houses, and it's been a little crazy around here lately. But I am in the new house now. Finally, I've got my office set up. So just a brief introduction about me. So I'm a big in the Power BI community site, community.powerbi.com. Written fair number of books, working on two currently, working on Power BI Cookbook 3rd edition, and it's supposed to be, well, we'll see how it works out. I have to limit the amount of pages to 600 pages, but if I can get it down to that amount, then it'll be released in color, which will be a first for one of my books. So that'd be nice to have that. So excited about that. And then currently writing the definitive guide to Power Query M with Rick DeGroot, Melissa DeCorte, and Brian Julius. That's I believe scheduled for a March release, but I guess it's available for pre-orders, and you can even see very early chapters if you have a pack subscription. So I've also written a bunch of external tools. Microsoft Hates Greg's Quick Measures, Mushgookum was the first one. It was really about basically a tool to be able to make authoring quick measures and make more quick measures available. And then, kind of took that and wrote a DAX editor, which is kind of a lightweight DAX editor with some nice features in it. And then just things that mess around with metadata and the ribbon and that sort of thing. And so I actually have two YouTube channels. Microsoft Hates Greg is the one. That's the kind of the crazy channel where I do things like exploding DAX volcanoes and different kinds of stuff like that, and do crazy stuff like create 70 tables in order to implement forecasting in DAX, that sort of thing. So it's kind of out there as far as the channel goes. And then obviously DAX for Humans is the channel which really was started to teach somebody from the ground up that had never seen Power BI or DAX before, to teach them the no calculate approach to DAX, which I think, and we'll talk about it, is more intuitive and an easier way to write DAX than what would be more traditional approach using kind of your calculate function as sort of the basis of it. So any questions about who I am or what I'm all about? All right. Okay, so
I don't think so. No questions so far. Do you want questions just as and when, or at the end, or how would you prefer it?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to have a conversation. Any kind of time somebody wants to join in, just chime in, and I'll try to stop talking, which is not easy for me sometimes.
Okay, no worries.
So I just wanted to kind of give a sort of a bit of history behind the no calculate approach. And despite what some people I think believe, I didn't just start out one day and say I'm going to thumb my nose at the DAX calculate industrial complex, and try to make waves and be controversial about how to write DAX. It really all started, and I can't thank Konstantinos enough. So early on in my DAX career, way back in like the 2015, 2016 timeframe, Konstantinos is the person that introduced me to DAX var statements. And you couldn't really have the no calculate approach without the DAX var statement. So I can't tell you how life-changing it was. I was working on a problem involving converting seconds duration into a duration format, hours, minutes, seconds. And I wrote this crazy DAX formula to do it, and it worked. And then Konstantinos came along and chimed in. He's like, this would be a lot cleaner if you just used var statements. I'm like, wait, what's a var statement? That's how little DAX I knew at that time. And I guess they were relatively new at that time. But so I'll be eternally grateful to Konstantinos for teaching me the var statement. Once I learned the var statement, everything in DAX kind of clicked. It became very intuitive. I could break complex problems down into steps. and solve it and see the intermediate results. So life-changing, really, when it comes to DAX. So then the other kind of formulaic thing that created no calculate approach was the Power BI communities. I was very active, even more. I still try to get on every day and answer a few questions. I was probably a lot more active back then, even. But I was having trouble answering the form questions using the traditional calculate approach. And it's because people don't tend to ask very good questions in the forums, or at least don't provide you all of the information. A lot of times they won't even tell you what their data model looks like, or what they have in their visual. And so it becomes very difficult to create a solution using calculate when you don't even know if they're using a star schema, which calculate sort of requires. If they're using single-threaded data model, then calculate sort of will return weird results a lot of times. So I was having a lot of problems answering form questions. And then I started kind of hit upon this approach of, hey, I'll use var statements and I'll use X aggregators. And suddenly I was able to answer a lot more questions and help a lot more people. It became a lot more consistent that I could, provide a solution to them. Because I wasn't making nearly the number of assumptions that I had to make when I was trying to use calculate to solve the problem. So then around 2018, I started using this approach more and more and published Time Intelligence the Hard Way, which we'll get into a little bit. I've got a demo on Time Intelligence that I'll show you, the no calculator approach versus using time intelligence functions versus using calculate. And then it's really started to solidify. We're on, I know, the measured totals issue, which I publish a daily meme about and have for over a year now about the measured total problem in Power BI. And the way to solve it is the no calculate approach, where you basically have to create a table to summarize your data exactly the way it appears in the visual, and then use an X aggregator across it, and then you can get a correct total. And I know there's people that don't agree that I use the term broken or incorrect, but intuitively, measure totals don't make sense sometimes in matrix and table visuals. So then I published the DAX cookbook in 2020. In this approach, I think I mentioned calculate once in the book, where I kind of felt obligated to that I at least had to mention the function and what it's used for. But then every other recipe, there's over 90 recipes in that book, and they all use the no calculate approach, which there was no term for at that time. It was just how I wrote my DAX. I think I did use a calculate table in at least one recipe, but that's pretty much the extent of where calculate and calculate table appear in that book. But I started getting a lot of I don't know if I would call it hate, but a lot of people took offense to the way I wrote my DAX, and especially on the community forums, I'd get a lot of negative feedback, if you will, where people were like, Greg, this isn't proper DAX. You don't know what you're doing with DAX, and all of this other stuff that I would get flack about. So I finally wrote an article on why I don't use calculate. I called it Calcu-Hate, and kind of listed in there why I don't use it. And then later on, there was a Ben Ferry video. I can't remember who he was interviewing, but it was a Power BI guy from Australia who worked in the mining industry. And I was watching that video, and I didn't have any idea. Somebody had kind of referred it to me, and the person mentioned, yeah. Then I read this article on Calculate called Calcu-Hate by Greg Deckler, and suddenly I was able to really start solving a lot more problems and being a lot more efficient with my DAX. I'm like, hey, that's me. I'm like, wow, somebody actually maybe finds this stuff useful. So anyway, so a while later, where it really took off was Enterprise DNA wanted me to do a presentation for one of their big conferences that they were having virtually. And so I created this presentation on DAX counterculture, which is kind of laid into, still wasn't called no calculate approach that back then. It was just, don't use calculate and don't use values, and hey, earlier is not the worst function on the planet, things like that kind of went against your traditional DAX culture at the time. And that was in August of 2022. And this is where things really took off. Brian Julius watched this presentation and just glommed onto this idea. And he's the one that actually coined no calculate. That's where it all came from. And so he started publishing on LinkedIn about the approach and about performance testing. And we had conversations offline about it. And we both agreed, well, this will probably never scale, right? I mean, because everything we'd been told is X aggregators are slow and calculates, so fast and everything else. And so we had kind of agreed behind the scenes that, well, it's you're going to be useful for probably 80-90% of the data models that are out there that are probably like single table data models, around 1 million rows or less, things like that. But then we started testing it, and Brian started doing some statistical analysis on it, and we started finding that it performed better in a lot of cases than just using Calculate. And I'll show some of that in some of the presentations. And then it really started taking off. We started getting more people, Owen Price and a few others, started to advocate the approach. And then we started getting, back to the hate, not that Alexis Olson hates, or anything, but Alexis Olson posted a couple of challenges on no calculate. They were very complex, like how to use a use relationship. So how to use an inactive relationship with the no calculate approach. And this is where Tamer June was really the star of the show. He solved both of these challenges and showed how the no calculate approach could be used in both those challenges. So, and I'll provide this this PowerPoint to Sue, so she can distribute to you guys if you guys want to follow any of the links here.
Brilliant, thank you. I was just going to ask that. I'll put it in the GitHub. I've put a link to the GitHub so that everyone can then have a look as well. Brilliant, thank you.
All right. Sorry, I got a phone call coming on my other computer. So any question around the history? So this was all, this was all other people in collaboration with other people. This is not my creation. This is really the creation of a community that was looking for a better, easier way to create DAX. And it was really the contributions of people like Konstantinos and Brian Julius and others that really created this approach. Okay, so Calculate. So Calculate makes DAX hard, in my opinion. So Calculate's an incredibly complicated function in and of itself. And I'll show that on the next slide. It requires a star schema or snowflake schema to really it does not handle single table data models very well. And this is where I think this kind of split between the DAX community occurs, right? You have your data professionals or BI professionals that are used to building out star schemas and snowflake schemas. They've already gone through the learning curve, if you will, with building out data models in that way. And then the other people that you have, the other persona that you have, are these people coming from Excel. And in Excel, you're used to dealing with a single table, right? You're used to dealing with a single spreadsheet. Typically, you may have multiple pages, but each one's kind of independent. Maybe you have some lookup values or VLOOKUPs and that sort of thing involved there. But primarily, you're dealing with a single table in Excel. And so this is where the no calculate really shines, is that it's useful both in star schemas, snowflake schemas, and single table data models. And I would say, and in fact, I can't say this because I'm still under NDA, so it's my opinion that over 70% of the data models published to Power BI in the service are single table data models. But that's just my opinion. I want to be clear on that. And then the other thing with Calculated, and this, I had a lot of problems with this, was it just wasn't natural for me to like nest all of these functions together. Which is what you sort of have to do with Calculate. You have to kind of think from the inside out, and you have to kind of read Calculate statements from the inside out to understand what's going on with them. And that just wasn't natural to me at all, which is where the VARs came in, really, which made it a lot more top-down kind of program, which is what I'm used to. And then the other issue with Calculate is you can't really see what's going on internally with the Calculate. You can't see the internal steps of how it's replacing the filter context or what table you end up with. You just end up with whatever your aggregation is that you've done with the Calculate function. So that was very difficult to me, and and especially when it comes to DAX and context and everything that comes into play, it's really, really useful to see what's internally going on at each step and be able to take a look at it and say, oh, okay, that's where the problem is. I'm telling it to do this, but this context is in there, and I'm only returning 3 rows when I should be getting 6 or whatever it happens to be. Okay, so Calculate's hard. So this actually comes off the SQLBI.com site. This is just one of their blurbs on Calculate. And this just describes internally what Calculate is doing at each step of the way. And so you really have to read this and understand all of this in order to really understand what Calculate is doing internally as it's making its calculations. And this is, this is like reading stereo instructions, right? I mean, it's fairly complicated. And then this is just one of, they have dozens of articles on Calculate. In fact, if you search the internet, you're probably going to come across dozens upon dozens, if not hundreds of articles on how Calculate works. And that just all speaks to me of complexity. And as a classically trained mechanical engineer, we were always taught that complexity is evil. And so I never liked black box functions. That's why I hate the time intelligence functions. They're just all very black boxy to me, and they're mysterious as to what they're doing, and you get weird results. So anyway, calculate to me is just another kind of this black box magic function that, it does what it does, but you can't really peek under the covers and see what it's really doing. So conversely, no calculate. So it follows very linear top-down structure. You can see what's going on every step of the way. It really actually mirrors how Power Query works, right? Within Power Query, each step you return a table, and you can visualize that table. And the same is true with a no calculate approach, right? You can actually visualize the tables using 2CSV. Now as a debugging, it's a lot easier than it used to be. You can visualize every variable along the way and return it and see what's going on at every step. So it's a lot easier to debug. It's very repetitive. Every measure, this is one of the one of Brian's observations is that writing DAX is almost boring. Using the no calculator approach, everything is just repetitive. You create a couple variables, you create a table variable using filter, and then you use an X aggregator, and it's every function. And basically, every measure you write follows that exact pattern. So it becomes very repetitive. Again, it's easy to debug. And really, I think it really cuts down on the number of functions that you have to learn for DAX. You really just need like filter, add columns, summarize, distinct, and select columns, and the X aggregators, and you're pretty much there as far as what you have to learn in terms of DAX to be able to do write and solve just about any problem in DAX. So those are the reasons. And again, really the approach for this and the reason why DAX for Humans exists is because I think that the culture within the DAX community has been very much driven by the BI professional persona that exists within the data community. And really the Excel users have been kind of forgotten about. And it's kind of bizarre to me because the Excel users are probably 80 or 90% of the users that are using Power BI, the business users. And your BI professionals really only represent about 10 to 20% of the people that use Power BI. So it's no surprise to me that there would be different approaches and a different way of learning DAX that would be useful for people that are coming from the business side of things. But I think too often technical folks, get wrapped up in, I don't know how to say it, but they just, they forget that not everybody has gone through the whole learning curve that they've done for the past 2 decades and learning star schemas and building cubes and all of that. And they just kind of dismiss, the business users coming at it and just how much of a learning curve Power BI really is and DAX really is. So any questions so far?
No question. Fernando wanted to know, what did the Italians say about it?
That's right. There is
controversial, straight to the point, Fernando.
That's a great video. I've watched that clip. Yeah, Alberto gets asked about the no calculator approach, and I think he said something like, "Oh, I don't like it."
Yeah.
But it's funny now because recently I've been seeing on SQLBI.com, they've been releasing more and more videos and content about X aggregators and even like how to use X aggregators to speed up and optimize your DAX measures. So it's almost, and I've never, everybody thinks that there's some kind of big conflict between like Alberto and Marco and myself. And there really isn't. I mean, we've had back channel conversations and we both understand each other's perspectives on it.
Well, Chewy's, hi Chewy. Chewy's in the chat, and I know Chewy from Saturday Morning Learning, and he said it absolutely correctly. Everybody learns in a different way, and so we all learn different things in different ways, and it's about making sure that everyone has the ability to learn in the best way for them. So, I think it's just like people like to have a gossip and find a reason for trauma when there isn't one. So yeah,
Oh,
it's good.
I had this one guy in the community forums who just, I think his name was Daxer was his screen name, and oh boy, did he give me heck over my DAX, multiple. He was actually the reason why I wrote calculate, why I don't use the calculate function, because just the amount of grief he gave me over it. So, but
yeah, you just think, oh, just live and let live, and let's all learn the correct way that works for our brains. Some things I get one way, sometimes the other, but for me, Power Query is my thing. I like Power Query. I like the step-by-step logical thing. So that works for me. And Fernando, visual calculations. So it's all we want everyone to learn and to be able to use the tool, because it makes a difference. So you choose what works for you. I think. Anyway, I'm going to stop yabbering and let you carry on, Greg.
oh no. So I kind of picked some of my favorite Power BI, no calculate approaches, and so I just thought I'd bring a couple up and just show, the no calculate approach as opposed to like a calculate approach in that. So one of my favorite ones is the running total, right? Whereas if you try to use the quick measure that Power BI gives you for calculating a running total, but you do it as a single table data model. So I have a dates table, but in this version, I'm not actually using the dates table. So let me zoom in here. So this is actually the formula to get back from Power BI's quick measure. If you select it, and all you're trying to do is create a running total on the table according to the date, which you've put into your visual at the month level granularity. So the classic approach is calculate the sum of the value, where you filter all selected, where you're selecting table date, is on or after table date, and the max of the table date, and descending. The problem with it is this works if you actually use a star schema. But if you have a single table data model, you can see that this is not a running total, right? Running total should keep going up, which this one does not. So the way to solve that, right, is you can create, use the no calculate approach, which I think this one, and again, this is right here is going to be your, I was actually, so that was, oh, okay, that was trying to do, somebody had asked a question about, how do I limit, but we'll use the classic one here. So better running total. So essentially I just grab the max of my date. So max of my date in context within the visual. Then I can filter all selected table where the date's less than that date, and then do a sum x across it. And lo and behold, single table data model, and I get a running total, right? So this one is just a different one where somebody was saying, what if I want to be able to cut it off at like March or something like that? So, I mean, and basically this exact pattern that you have right here, and then so this one is actually using the dates table. So I get the max of the dates table. So this is if I have a star schema. So the first one was single table data model. This one is a star schema. I get the max of my date, from the dates table. I then filter all selected table where the date is less than that date and do a sum x across it. And lo and behold, it works as well. So get a running total. So, I mean, but this basic, you don't need to use fancy functions like is on or after or anything else. I tend to just use things like less than or equal than, versus using is on or after. And, just use simple things like filter statements and max and your X aggregator. And that's all you really need to know to learn no calculate approach to things. Now, the nice thing about this is, for example, if I go over here and it's running total 2, if I want to actually see what's going on within my table, right, I can use this toCSV function on my table. Well, if I could type, so then I can actually see what's included within that table. Right? I can actually see all the dates involved, and it maxes out at 10 by default, but there's a optional parameter with toCSV where you can, set it to be like 50 or 100 or whatever it is. Anyway, so you can actually see what's going on at every step of the way within the function. You can return that max date. You can return what the table rows are within your table. So you actually debug it and see if something's going wrong, what's going wrong. So any questions about? I mean, it's very simple example.
I like the way you did the toCSV and then just then just did the commenting out the result so that you're not losing it, you're not having to put it back in. It's just a really simple, effective, effective method of flipping between the end result and the questions. Brian and Henrique's put no questions about this apart from Fernandez says visual calculations go this way, that putting it within the table, and Brian saying no calculate, just checks all the boxes because he likes to know how things work. So they're all chatting away with you, Greg.
Yeah, visual calculations, I'm kind of interested to see where that goes. They've, the stuff they've released so far, they still haven't made the switch. The only way I see it working is if they actually use the table visual itself as the data model for the calculation within DAX, because that's where the window function and the offset function. I've got a video or two on this on DAX on Microsoft Hates Greg about where I can totally break like the window function and the offset function. And basically it's because, if you have unmatched rows between tables, the DAX doesn't know that, because it's still looking at the data model. It's not looking at the table. And so you get weird results back. Anyway, until they fix that, and I'm hoping that's going to be for the release of visual calculations, that they're actually going to have the DAX, the DAX look at the table as the data model or the matrix as the data model versus the actual data model. But I don't see how they're going to solve it without doing that. But I've been wrong before.
Yeah, I think Jay, I mean, I don't know because I'm not that technical, but I think Jay said that it does put it into the table form, but I won't say because I wouldn't want to put words into his mouth, but he was saying you have to think of it as a table rather than the data model. But we'll see. It comes out in March, and it looks quite exciting. So it looks very exciting. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens.
So here's another example. This was one that came up, like one of the first arguments against it was, well, how do you do an all accept without calculate? So the idea here is that if I can find one of these, all accept without calculate, I'll just go with this is all accept with calculate. So this is how you would do it. So you say calculate the sum of the value, all accept table month. So basically I can ignore quarter, right? If I all accept with calculate, it doesn't change if I'm selecting different quarters. This number doesn't change anywhere. But if I select a particular month, then it actually I different results in that. So, and this doesn't work because there we go. So March versus April versus May, right? So all accept without calculate. So what we can do here is I just grab a distinct table month, which if I've got one, if I have more than 1 month or whatever happens to be, returns a table of the distinct months. I then create a table var, which is just all table, which then I then filter where the month is in the months table that I've returned. And then if is filtered table month, I do a sum x of the value of table 1 value, otherwise I sum x to the table value. So my table var. So essentially what I've done here is I've got a table var, which has all the table. And then I've got a table 1 var, which is my filtered set. And so basically by checking out whether table month is filtered or not, I can return the sum x across either the filtered table or the entire table. And as you can see, it performs identically, all except calculate 2. Basically, it performs you get the exact same numbers, right, as with the calculate version. And it does ignore, right, quarter, right? So these numbers haven't changed when I select quarter. That's how you do an all except without calculate. Let's see, we're coming up to a half hour here, so I'll skip ahead to this time intelligence one. So the time intelligence one, basically, it's I think the only person that hates time intelligence, functions more than I do is Brian Julius. He has posted about this quite extensively. But in this case, I have like 2 different versions of using calculate. So if I can find these here, these are your classic, year to date using calculator net sales. I think I actually include these in like either Mastering Power BI or Power BI Cookbook. These are basically the formulas that are used in that book. The middle one is using actually the time intelligence function, total year to date. So the DAX is pretty simple, right? And then these over here, these are the no calculate versions. So essentially, DAX is a little more complex, but to me, it makes a lot of sense, right? So I'm using max date. I'm getting my year. I then do a summarize of my fact sales table by order date, and then my year and my sales, and then I can do some X across that. The interesting thing about it is, and this holds true for almost all of these, quarter to date, month to date, week to date, previous year, all of these different time intelligence calculations that you can do, including previous week and previous week to date, which you have no time intelligence functions for week. But if you actually start recording this and refresh the visuals, so you'll see that so this is the total year to date. So 1,584 milliseconds. And what we're really interested in is how long the DAX query took. So in this case, the DAX query took 1,317 milliseconds versus the calculate approach took 2,233 milliseconds. And the same is pretty much true for the calculate 2 approach, was just a different version, took almost 2,000 milliseconds. But if you look at the no calculate, it took 10 times less than the calculate version. Took 289 milliseconds. And that's also far less than total year to date, which is a time intelligence DAX function purposely built just for that task. But we can beat it hands down with the no calculate approach. And this is pretty much holds true for all of these different, all of these different. In fact, I have a video called, I think it's called "I Spit on Your Grave." It's got time intelligence on a tombstone on the Microsoft Hates Greg channel, and it goes through this in depth and goes through every single one of these and shows the performance difference between them all. So despite what everyone has told me early on, is that my DAX sucked and it was going to be slow and wasn't going to scale. I mean, I also have another video where I go up to, I think I created a data set with 100 million rows and did some calculations across it and showed that the no calculate approach was as fast or faster than any other approach. And again, Brian Julius has done extensive work on this subject, and we just can't find where this breaks down or breaks. Again, I don't hold out that in certain scenarios maybe it's going to be a lot slower or something like that, but we really haven't found the use case. And we've had people try, like Alexis Olson, bless his heart. He's tried to trip us up, I don't know how many times, to break the no calculate approach, but it's come out victorious so far. So that's really all I had, unless Brian, you want to come off on mute and put in your 2 cents on this approach. You've probably been the biggest advocate, and you literally coined the term. So I think you have every right to chime in here if you wish.
How does just a quick one? How does Alexis handle the fact if you that you're beating him hands down?
Oh,
with good grace,
yeah, he's been perfectly gracious about it. Again, I think people tend to think that there's more of a conflict going on than what there is. Again, the other thing about the no calculate approach is that Brian and I always say is, like, you don't lose your no calculate card if you slip a calculate into a calculation. Like, it's not an exclusive either or kind of thing. It's just, hey, if you use calculate and you find it useful, then by all means keep using it. But I feel, and I think some other people feel, that this approach to DAX is just a little more logical and easier to pick up for people that are brand new to the subject versus trying to learn the intricacies of calculate.
Who's here? Brian, do you want to say hello?
Hey, everybody. Hey, Greg.
Hey.
Yeah, I would totally, echo what Greg says. If calculate is working for you and DAX is not a problem, then we got nothing for you here. I really think it's if, when I see there was an interesting poll that was done. I believe it was Dustin Shimmick last week did a poll on LinkedIn that said DAX is, and there were just two, learning DAX is blank, and it said easy or hard. Those are the only 2 choices. And it was really interesting to me the way that broke down. it actually 55% of people said learning DAX is easy, which I, I was shocked.
Yeah,
I was
me too.
shocked.
My mouth open. I'm like, really? I've had,
Um,
you know.
They're all using no calculate.
except,
I
except
remember
I answered hard.
struggling.
And so I think it really does kind of split in some ways. And so, for the people who are answering DAX is hard and people who are struggling with DAX, um, I really, I think this has a tremendous amount to offer those folks. And I think there's somebody made a statement that knowing both is really the ideal. It's not
Yeah.
one or the other. And I think Greg and I try to kind of walk a strict line sometimes in terms of saying there's nothing you can't do with no calculate that you can do with calculate, that all accept, and using inactive relationships and all these things you can totally do in no calculate. There are times it is a bit of a workaround. I mean, using intersect or contains for to activate an inactive relationship is really not ideal. And so there are cases where it just makes more sense. And so kind of knowing both. But the thing that I've spent a lot of time on, I was actually just working on more yesterday, is this idea that everybody just assumed it would break down at scale. And I mean, you can't ever prove the null hypothesis definitively, but I have tested this thing up, down, sideways, 6 ways to Sunday, and I have yet to find any situation where comparing a set of measures that's calculate versus no calculate at any scale that my computer can handle, 30 million rows or fewer, where it comes out different. It statistically it shows no difference every time I've run it in every conceivable way. And so this assumption that it's going to fail and break down at scale, I see no evidence for. If somebody can provide me a data set where that's true, I'd love to see it. And we've kind of been beating the drum for somebody to come up with that, but nobody has yet.
I see Christian's comment in the chat, that yes, every measure, yes, the proper name for this is no explicit calculate, but that is terrible marketing. So that is absolutely true, but that is just a terrible marketing phrase. So that is why we went with no calculate. But yes, I mean, calculate, I think that's part of what people don't understand is going on, is that the DAX that you're writing, it's kind of like the SQL. When you write SQL, right, it's not executing your SQL exactly like you wrote it, right? It's coming up with a query plan behind the scenes, and it's doing all kinds of optimization. And DAX is very similar to that, right? When you write your DAX, internally, the engine is taking that DAX and interpreting it and creating a query plan for optimizing how to go get that data that you're telling it that you want. And so again, DAX is, it does all of that internal optimization, and there's things that you can do in SQL that, that aren't intuitively obvious to help it, figure out the right query plan to make it faster. And I think that's some of what's going on with the no calculate approach, and why it tends to be faster in some cases than calculate, is that it's providing more hints along the way in terms of figuring out an optimal query plan to go query the data model. But again, but there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. But I do my classic approach, where I don't care, right? I'm an end user. I don't care what it's doing behind the scenes, that it wraps it in a calculate, or what it's doing as far as query plan optimization or anything, because I can't affect any of that. The only thing I can affect is the way I write my DAX, in the DAX that I write, and that it's maintainable for me and it makes sense to me. And if it happens to provide the query engine some hints on how to go get the data faster, that's a bonus.
Question for you.
Yeah.
But we still want to do perform good data modeling, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my question. I'm curious about.
So yes, if you want to, right? Again, I would go back to the fact that the vast majority of data models published to the service are single table data models, because that's what end users, business users tend to have worked within Excel. So yes, is that a bad data model, quote unquote bad data model? Sure, if you're a BI professional, that's a bad data model. It should be a star schema. If I've put my BI, professional hat on. But, that's an extra learning curve for everybody. So yeah, if you understand star schemas and build out your data models that way, perfectly fine. But you don't have to, I guess, is the point with no calculate. If you want to work with a single table data model and get your DAX not to return wonky results like the running total, it's perfectly possible to do. But again, as a BI person, I could never tell you don't go create star schemas. Yes, that is absolutely the proper way of doing it.
Yeah, and I think it's that horses for courses is what we say in the UK. If you've got a single table, you've got a single table. But if you've got multiple, it's you build what you need for what the customer requirements are, and you have that flexibility to be able to do so. But there's a few questions coming in for you.
Yep, I see that Samps. I can't pronounce Michael. I'm just gonna say Michael. So no calculate works with star schemas, works with snowflake schemas, works with flat single table data models. So it works with all of them. Versus calculate really only works with snowflake and star schemas, and you can get wonky results when dealing with single table data model. So I'm not saying that necessarily makes it better or worse or anything. But yeah, if you think about it in terms of the no calculate approach, every one of your star schema dimension tables is connected to your fact table, right? So if you use a date in your dimension table versus the date in your fact table, there's really no difference. And from a no calculate perspective, you can use either one. They're both going to filter the table, the fact table, the way you want it to. And yes, all of these files that I've presented here, they should all be available. There's a GitHub repository for Microsoft Hates Greg, and there's also a GitHub repository for DAX for Humans, where I share out all the PBIX files that if it's not there, send me a note via LinkedIn and let me know, and I'll get it out there.
Yeah.
But all these files that I've shared today, either they're in the quick measure gallery, like Better Running Total, and I actually created a version of all of the stock Power BI quick measures formulas. I created a version using no calculate. Those are all up in the quick measure gallery. You can download the PBIXs. This TI file is available, should be available on the Microsoft Hates Greg GitHub repository.
Yeah, I've just posted a link for the GitHub in the chat, so it should be there, so people can have a look. And Christian's realised he already has them, and I bet if you check Brian Julius's GitHub, he's probably got the macros for Tablet Editor in there as well. I suspect it might be there. It could be wrong, but it might not be. Anyway, I will let you carry on, Greg.
No, it's really all I had. It's really all I had prepared. I was going to beat the measure total, drum to death, but I'd probably beat that horse dead enough on a daily basis with my memes. So, but really, the way to solve measure totals is the no calculate approach. I don't know of a way to solve it using calculate really.
So for those that haven't seen the no measures totals, I think as you can beat your drum because you're here delivering to us. So please feel free to.
Well, today's was a guy kicking an alligator, so that was today's meme. So the guy kicking the alligator was measure totals, and the alligator was the users. So if there's one thing that Microsoft could do to make Power BI easier, it's solve the measure total problem. I literally answer on average at least 1 or 2 questions in the community forums every day on, hey, I've got a total and it's not right. And that's really, I got tired of it. I have a macro for it. I still got tired of answering that question in the forums, which is why I decided one day to post a meme, and then that meme blew up. And so I just because I am who I am, I just decided I'll just keep doing it until Microsoft fixes it.
And Fernando has said he's seen you still answering those total questions in the community portal, and that you still take the time to do that. So I think there's a bit of respect going out to you from Fernando, and Greg and Brian. I suspect is having a little encouragement for you. Is there a plan for DAX Cookbook Second Edition?
I would love to write a DAX Cookbook Second Edition. In fact, I have an entire folder of dedicated PBIX files that are like recipes for a DAX Cookbook Second Edition. The short answer to that, though, is there are no immediate plans, because that book sold the worst by far of all my books.
Oh, really?
From Pact. So Pact is much more interested in me coming up with a third edition of Power BI Cookbook, a third edition of Mastering Power BI, probably going to be a third edition of Learn Power BI. So they're far more interested in those titles right now than DAX Cookbook, just based upon sales alone.
That's
which is unfortunate, because DAX Cookbook was my favorite book that I ever written on Power BI.
That's crazy, isn't it? And Christian says he thinks Visual Calcs will fix the total measures.
Yep, that's the word from Microsoft, that not initially. So everything I've seen is that when they're initially released, they won't fix measure totals. I really think they're going to be the basis for fixing measure totals, but I think we're going to have to wait for the Power Pivot visual to get released before measure totals are going to get fixed. And my expectation is the Power Pivot visual is going to work basically exactly like pivot tables in Excel, where you can actually choose what kind of aggregation you want for the total, whether you want it to be the sum or an average or a max or a min, that it will have that interface built into the visual. One other thing I want to clear up about measure totals is I think a lot of people blame DAX and say, well, they make statements like, well, that's how DAX works. But it's not how DAX works. It's really not up to DAX to determine what the total should be. It's really up to the visual. And the way I justify that is I point to stacked visuals. Whereas if you turn on a total for a stacked visual, magically the total is the sum of the components, right? The sum of the legend, if you will, or what you've used as far as to the categories. And the same is true for a waterfall chart. If you turn on totals for a waterfall chart, they're magically the right totals. And in fact, I've even done things with like a -5 example. I put it in a table, and it's a wrong total because it's just taking the sum of everything, then -5 versus -5 of each of the individual rows and totaling those. But then I flip it to a stacked visual chart and the total is correct, right? It's the actual sum of the rows, if you will. So, I mean, it has nothing to do, in my opinion, has nothing to do with DAX. It's all about whoever wrote the table matrix visuals, which is why the memes of the table matrix visual creator going to hell or going to extra hell, why those exist. And that's my opinion, is that it's really and if you think about it logically about separation of concerns, right? DAX only knows about the data model, right? It knows nothing about really what's going on at the visual level. Only the visual can know what's going on at the visual level. So that's why DAX, should not be responsible for a correct total. It's really up to the visual to do that calculation, because it's the only thing that knows what's in the visual.
So we've got two things. Henrique is waiting patiently with his hand up, so I'll let Henrique ask the question. And Oliver hasn't heard of the visual calc yet, so we've put a YouTube link in there, but we can mention that as well. So I'll let Henrique ask a question because he's been waiting very patiently.
Well, it's not so much a question, but a little input from my side. I came quite late to the game of the data world. I was an IT consultant for many years. But then I went all in, and now I have 2 periods where I've been working with some hardcore backends in big companies. And in both cases, we try to, I've helped them with some DAX, complicated DAX. And we're talking about data models with +100 tables. So very big data models. And we had this complicated DAX. They couldn't solve it. And I solved it with this no calculate way where we can see the intermediate tables and what things could debug on it. And they totally bought in on the idea also of building the DAX. Because they said, just like when we're building a SQL statement with CTE, they're also using intermediate tables there and making some calculation in the end. So it's been just so wonderful powers you have when you can master this model, this method.
Yeah, I think
not just with one table data models.
I think it's a great point, Henrik. Most of the examples you'll see on SQLBI.com and most of the other examples that leverage Calculate are extremely idealized, simple data models with like one fact table and a couple dimensions around it. And Calculate can really shine in those kind of worlds, like the AdventureWorks database, or your Contoso databases, or your worldwide importers database, where they're very idealized. But I hate to use this term, but in the real world, like when I'm working with customers with Power BI, it's never that, right? They have literally dozens of fact tables, and you got relationships all over the place, and inactive relationships all over the place, and literally dozens, if not hundreds, of tables in these data models, and they're very complex data models.
It's also the case when you have to combine some fact tables. You have to have some rows from this fact tables and this fact tables put together and calculated upon. And it gets very hard using Calculate. But
and maybe and maybe people will say, well, it's just a bad data model. And I don't know that, because usually I'm walking into these things and somebody else has been responsible for building out this data model, and I'm just there to help them with the reporting and get the numbers to be correct in that. But
But good luck solving that. Good luck repairing that plus 100 data model that they've been working on in 10 years. And then you can fix their DAX in an easy way instead.
And yeah, so he's a great success, Henrik. We had our chat, our catch up, and it was when he'd sort of proved the point within a, so he's really thrilled with the method. And Oliver was just asking about visual calcs. What is a visual calc?
So supposedly Microsoft's coming out with visual level calculations. So I think InfoRiver has like some table and matrix visuals that include the capability to do a visual level calculation. So essentially what you're doing, think of it as, ideally the way it should work is that instead of looking at the data model to do the calculation, it actually looks at the table or matrix visual as the data model, and does the calculation there. So based upon that, so in theory, right, it should be a fix for an easier way to create a total that is an average of the rows, or the sum of the rows, or something like that. In theory, everything they kind of laid the basis of it with window and offset and index, but they still haven't made the conversion from those functions looking at the data model versus the visual as the data model. But in theory, it should provide an easier way to get a correct total or whatever. But my always retort to that is, well, that's nice, but you still have to write code. Even if it's simpler code, you're still forcing the user to write code for something that, in my opinion, should just be a configuration, right? The visuals should say drop down. I want it to calculate, the way it calculates, or I want it to get the sum of the rows or the average of the rows. To me, that's good UI UX design. But what do I know?
Well, there was Jay did a fabulous session at Data Weekender at the weekend on the last one on the Saturday, and I think the videos are coming out. So it's good to see that there are beginning to have different methods to be able to use DAX without it making us cry. And Oliver said it looks like you're about to go into a boxing match against Calculate. Everybody
wants to get me in a debate with Alberto and Marco Russo about Calculate versus no Calculate, but there wouldn't be any debate there. I think again, I've had conversations with Marco and Alberto. It's like they see my point, I see their point. We can agree to disagree on certain things, but both are valid approaches. And again, like I said, even SQLBI.com, you're starting to see more and more content about that's not focused on Calculate solely, but focused on like SumX and the X aggregators and that sort of thing. So
yeah. And Marco did some lovely challenges over lockdown. He put it in on a Saturday, just little challenges on how to do things using lots of, I think that's where I sort of learned a lot of the SumX tricks with the challenges that Marco put in. Again, really simple tables, and it was just making you think. So you know.
Well, the interesting thing about is that there's and I can't confirm or deny this because I don't know DAX at the level of some people do, but there's a lot of people that claim that really the sum function is just sugar syntax for sum x, and average is sugar syntax for average x. I don't know that 100% true or not, but there's a lot of very smart people out there in the community that claim that is the case.